I'm the Director of Operations at the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. It's an honor and a great pleasure to have been asked to introduce Ted tonight. Or should I say, Mr. Israel Pundit himself. Our institute holds Ted in great esteem, so much so that IISS, that's the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, not to be confused with ISIS, we've entered into an association with Ted, which we're very proud that we're able to do in his widely read and influential blog. Ted is a tireless Zionist warrior. He's in defense of the Jewish people, and he always has been. He epitomizes the very, very best of the liberal hawk, who struggles against the delusional messages emanating from dovish leftist circles in the media, the legal establishment, and much of academia. He highlights their distortions and exposes their omissions and concealment of facts and downright lies. Ted's talk tonight is Obama's Middle East debacle. The Obama administration is largely staffed by purported human rights activists who hide behind a facade of disproven political correctness and are pushing their own radical agenda, totally detached from the dramatically changing landscape in international affairs. The Obama government is now a prisoner of events, largely of their own actions, or lack thereof. They chose to subordinate the conduct of their foreign policy to the dictates, the constraints, and ideological illusions, and even if we accept that they had perhaps good intentions, where have good intentions ever been effective in remedying international conflict? Obama has alienated allies and appeased adversaries, branding Israel as a scapegoat for all of the Middle East conflicts. And under Obama, the US has removed the footprint from most of the world's regional conflicts and undermined the interests of the United States, itself, and those of its allies, but in particular, Israel. Ted's talk will address these seemingly irreversible foreign policy debacles that has created such widespread death, destruction, and anarchy that threatens Israel, the Western interests, and for many more years to come. Now we're going to get an expert.
First, we're going to make himself comfortable. He's going to sit down.
Oh, I just want to, sorry, I'm running. Martin Sherman, who is the executive director of the Institute, had this, he's very sorry he couldn't come, he really wanted to, but he had this to say. He said, Ted Belman is an inspiring example of selfless and limitless 24/7 dedication and devotion to the state of Israel, the Jewish people and the Zionist ideals. He's in every way the epitome of a patriot in the most noble sense of the word. With unassuming determination through his widely read and widely respected blog, he toils unstintingly, unstinted to inform and educate his readership and to expose and debunk pernicious myths propagated by Israel's detractors. And Martin is very proud to have him as a colleague and a friend.
Is this working now if I just have to decide? It's really an honor to have people like the stature of Martin Sherman and Malcolm Dash introduce me and appreciate my work. And the feeling is mutual, and I appreciate that. Now, in putting this this article or talk together, I had to figure out who am I talking to. Am I talking to people who know as much as me, or am I talking to people who are novices? And I wanted to meet sort of a happy balance in this, and hopefully I've achieved that. Hopefully I've achieved that. As I indicated in my description, I was going to start and give you the background of who Obama is. And I'm going to start with that. As you know, Obama was born in 1961. His mother's name was Ann Dunham, and his father's name was Barack Obama Sr. They realized that she was pregnant and then got married, but the marriage wasn't a real marriage. He left in a couple of years to go to Harvard. She actually left in a couple months to go to Washington State University. So it really wasn't a marriage. Now, a couple of years later, she met an Indonesian, another Muslim, an Indonesian. They got married, and she took Barack Obama to Indonesia to live with her new husband. His name was Lolo Sotoro, and Lolo adopted Barack Obama, and from that point on, he was known as Barry Sotoro, using the last name. He was sent to school, and in the school he went to, they had to identify the religion, and they identified the religion as Islam. As a result of that identification, they were taught about Islam. And he studied and memorized the Quran in the 4 years that he was there. He went there at 6 years old. And so that was his experience. Now, I just found out the other day that in Indonesia, they speak Indonesian. I didn't know there was a language Indonesian. But in any event, that's the case. When he was 10 years old, his mother sent him back to her parents in Hawaii, and they were going to bring him up while she did her own thing, and she went on, I think, to get a PhD in anthropology. So here we have two PhD parents, if they are the real parents. That's a whole separate story. But we'll leave that one alone. In any event, his grandfather in Hawaii had a friend whose name was Frank Marshall Davis. He was black, he was a communist of note, and he was a sex pervert of note. He was a constant visitor at Obama's home, at his grandparents' home, and he took it upon himself to tutor Obama in the intricacies of communism. And this was weekly. This was going on throughout his high school years. Now, Obama, when he was an adult, he wrote a few lines about his mother, which were very illuminating. And he said in one of the books that his mother was, quote, an anthropologist and Islamophile who hated America and subsequently goes native. So you can see her mentality. You might wonder whether that rubbed off on Obama. Obama went on to say that she was the biggest influence in his life and values, and he mirrors who she was. In Obama's own words, that's how he looked at this. Now, after graduating Harvard Law, he moved to Chicago to start the practice of law. Have you ever wondered why a Harvard law graduate would give up the practice of law to become a community organizer? Does anyone ever think about that? Now, in Chicago, he ran with a certain crowd. As we all do, we run with like-minded people. Here are some of his close associates. The first, William Ayres, who was an unrepentant weatherman terrorist, who together with a few other terrorists bombed the Pentagon in the 60s. And that's fact. And this guy, William Ayers, also hosted the first fundraiser for Obama when he ran to be the Illinois state senator. It was in his home, and they were very, very close. So that's number one guy. Then there's Rashid Khalidi. Rashid Khalidi, very important guy. He taught Middle Eastern studies at Columbia University, and he was also the spokesperson for Yasser Arafat and the PLO. A very, very important guy. And then there was Edward Said. Maybe you've heard of him. He was very, very famous in Middle East studies, and he wrote the book, almost the Bible, called Orientalism. And Orientalism is the theory that the reason the Arab world is backward is because the colonial West made certain that they would be backward and not advance, so that they would always be dependent on the West. This book became the Bible for all Middle Eastern studies throughout the United States, called Orientalism. Then there was a character, Ali Abu Nima. He was the founder of a blog called the Electronic Intifada. And this blog was extremely anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas. And at the time that Obama was running for office as president, Abu Nima put in a blog entry in which he said, "Oh, I bumped into Barack Obama the other day, and I asked him why he isn't pushing the Palestinian cause. And he said that he can't push it now that he's running for office, but wait till he's elected." And this was printed from his good friend, Ali Abu Nima. And finally, not much has to be said about Obama and Michelle and their daughters attending Reverend Wright's church for 20 years. This church was a church like no other. They were extremely anti-American, and the big refrain in his sermons was "Goddamn America." They were pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, and considered Jesus to be a Palestinian, I think. Now, some pastors phoned up this church trying to get a story on it, and they said, "We have many Muslims here in attendance. You don't have to be a baptized Christian to be a member and go there for 20 years. So that was Reverend Wright. And then finally, in his neighborhood lived Louis Farrakhan, who was the founder and head of the Nation of Islam. And Barack Obama had an open door. Although there's a huge spread in years, he had an open door to Farrakhan. And when Barack Obama was setting up his campaign, many workers from the Nation of Islam worked for him. And they were sent over by Farrakhan. So that's another person, part of his circle. This is who he was. And as I made a comment here, this was the Barack Hussein Obama that 80% of American Jews voted for twice. How does that happen? But it happened. People don't want to know, and certainly the mainstream media doesn't want to publish. Now, last year, Megyn Kelly, who I love, I don't know, maybe Trump doesn't love her, but I love her. She was hosting a panel of citizens asking questions and having feedback. And one woman tried to introduce the idea that Obama was a Muslim. And she shut this person down emphatically, and she said, "Obama is not a Muslim." Now, where that comes from really rots my socks, because why aren't you open to the discussion? But it was shut off. Now, why do I say that he is a Muslim? Very basic. If you're born of a Jewish mother, you're a Jew. If you're born of a Muslim father, you're a Muslim. It's as simple as that. Now, he has never been baptized into the Christian faith. He has never moved away from Islam as his identity. And all Muslims in the world consider him to be a Muslim. He knows more about the Muslim religion than he does about Christianity. He studied it for 4 years in school. Now, one other, okay, after his, go a little too fast. Okay. Barack Obama's father, as I mentioned, abandoned him after he was born, yet somehow Obama stayed close to his father's family, many of whom were Islamists. And normally you would think he was never president. He disappeared within 2 years. Isn't it odd that Obama would end up with a very strong relationship with the family? And part of that is that Obama wanted to emphasize, he was torn between being white and Christian on the one sense, and his mother, and that was his roots, and on the other hand, being black and Muslim. And he made a choice to identify with black and Muslim. He had a half-brother, which you may or may not know, whose name was Malik Obama. And Malik Obama was the best man at his wedding. And he came all outfitted in African garb. He was from Kenya in the main in America, but he wore traditional African garb in his role and at the wedding. Now this guy is a very interesting guy. In 2008, he started a charitable foundation in America, and he raised money to support Islamist causes. And in 2011, Lois Lerner, Barack Obama's gal at the IRS, approved the charitable status and made it retroactive to 2008. And so the charity was being used to fund Islamism. Now, Malik, who was known as a Islamist and was quite radical, he had a very good friend in Kenya by the name of Raila Odinga. And Odinga was the opposition leader, one of the opposition leaders in the parliament in Kenya. Now, I looked it up just before I came. Kenya is 83% Christian and 11% Muslim. And Odinga, in order to build his base, he made a deal with, I didn't write it down, but a Muslim society. And they signed a memorandum of agreement. And in that memorandum of agreement, he committed to making Sharia law, the law of the land, to opening up Sharia courts all over, not just in Muslim areas, and to spread the religion of Islam through all the schools. And this was who he was, and he was a radical. Now, why do I mention this Raila Odinga? Because when Obama was an Illinois senator in 2008, he traveled to Kenya to stump for Raila Odinga. And he was so irritating to the Kenya government that, according to a Kenya government spokesperson, quote, Obama's bias for his friend was so blatant that the government found it necessary to complain that Obama appeared to be Odinga's stooge. Now, Obama had a very close relationship with this Odinga long before the stumping and long after. When I say close, I mean close. For instance, when he was running for office, they used to talk twice a day from Kenya. This was a really solid relationship. Now, the Washington Times wrote up this relationship, and I'm going to read you what they had to say, because they were so thrown by, here's what's a American senator going to a foreign country to stump for, here's what they said. Mr. Obama's judgment is seriously called into question when he backs an official with troubling ties to Muslim extremists and whose supporters practice ethnic cleansing, and genocide. It was Islamic extremists in Kenya who bombed the US Embassy in 1998, killing more than 200 and injuring thousands. None of this has dissuaded Mr. Obama from maintaining disturbing loyalties. And that's how the Washington Times saw this relationship. And finally, on this note, his grandmother, step-grandmother on his father's side in Kenya, also raised money to send Kenyan students to the most radical Wahhabist madrasas in Saudi Arabia. This is Barack Obama's family. Okay? And I say to you, make of it what you will, but I don't know how you can ignore it as formative for him. Now, before his inauguration in January 28th or something, 09, he contacted Prime Minister Olmert, who was in the middle of a war with Hamas. And he put out the word that I want that war to end before my inauguration. And Olmert ended the war before the inauguration. And that was before he was even sworn in. Now, Obama's first call was to Mahmoud Abbas. His first interview was with an Arab network. In it, he stressed his own Muslim ties and his hopes for a Palestinian state. Obama ordered the expenditure of $20 million in migration assistance to Gazans affected by Olmert's war in Gaza, and he pledged $900 million in aid for rebuilding Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. This was after the huge economic dislocation in 2008. He's sending off $900 million for reconstruction there. And he also started hiring Muslims for the White House. And he made certain to infiltrate not just Muslims, Muslim Brotherhood Muslims throughout the US administration. Now, all this, by the way, was in the first 2 months of office. So, essentially, this outreach was intended to upgrade US relations with Muslims in general and to downgrade the relationship with Israel. I'm going to pause here for a moment because I want to give you a little history. Most people don't understand where America is coming from in all their policies with regard to Israel. I just want to give you some background and to fill you in, and then I'll continue with this narrative. Okay. As far back as the debate in Truman's office about whether to recognize Israel or not, the position of those opposing recognition was simple: oil, numbers, history. Quote, there are 30 million Arabs on one side and 600,000 Jews on the other, Defense Secretary Forrestal told Clifford. Why don't you face up to the realities? Now, Clifford was fighting for the recognition of Israel, but that was the capsule comment about where America is coming from then and is still coming from today, and I'll expand on that. Truman, for various reasons, in part because of his partner in the haberdashery business and other reasons, he decided that the Jews were entitled to a state. And he instructed the State Department to vote yes, one of the first countries, if not the first, to recognize the state of Israel. And Truman mentioned his misgivings that he thought that Israel's independence would be short-lived, that they would be destroyed and defeated by the Arab invasion that was just beginning to come. So he expected that Israel would be destroyed in that invasion. When the Saudis organized an oil embargo after the '73 war, they sent a message to the American administration saying the embargo wouldn't be lifted unless, quote, the political struggle between Israel and the Arabs is settled in a manner satisfactory to the Arabs. That was orders. And you know how concerned America was with that oil embargo, and the lineups went around the block waiting for oil, and this was a very traumatic thing. And there's no way America wanted that to continue or to happen again. So after getting this ultimatum and demand, the US got the message, and Kissinger promised to an Iraqi diplomat to shrink Israel back to the 67 lines. This was in papers released 30 years later, the conversation that he had with the Iraqi diplomat, promising exactly what I told you he was promising him, that America was going to shrink Israel back to the 67 lines. Now, you will recall that Clinton did his utmost, this is Bill Clinton, did his utmost to get Arafat and Rabin to sign a peace agreement, and it didn't succeed. And many people blamed Israel, and I think those who really pay attention know that it was Arafat that bolted. But when George Bush came into office, he didn't want to go through all that, and he decided he would just let it lie fallow, and he wouldn't put his energy, and he wouldn't try to make a deal. So what happened was that George Bush came into office, as I say, ignoring the Arab-Israeli conflict. This was seen by Saudi Arabia as a pro-Israel policy. In August 2011, the Saudis sent, 2011, listen to the month, the Saudis sent a letter to Bush warning that Saudi Arabia may need to reassess its relations with the United States if the United States didn't change its policies. Well, George Bush and Secretary Powell had a heart attack and immediately sent a message back to Saudi Arabia saying, we're going to change our policies and we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. The speech where Bush was going to do this was to happen on 9/12. And one day after, it was going to happen on Sunday, and 9/11 took place on Saturday. Or whatever, but it was the day after. It was the day after that Bush was supposed to make this speech. Okay? Now, okay, George Bush's fear of Saudi Arabia was so strong. Not only did he promise to recognize the state when he didn't want to get involved at all, but he made sure to fly all the Saudi diplomats and personnel out of America within the first 24 hours when nobody else was flying. And to really drive that home, when the report came in that the Congress, I think, ordered for what happened in 9/11, the administration redacted all references to Saudi Arabia because they didn't want them to be on the hot seat. You know that 19 or 15 of the hijackers in that atrocity were Saudis. And most of them were college graduates, by the way, debunking the idea that it's out of desperation and poverty that people are terrorists. Now, that became part of why America didn't go to the root problem and decided to go to an offshoot, Al-Qaeda, to fight Al-Qaeda as though that was the problem. And they refused to recognize the real problem, which was the ideology fueling all these groups, including Saudi Arabia. Now, something else happened that I just want to make a note of before I return to my remark. In 2004, during the Bush years, AIPAC was very, very powerful to the consternation of the people on the left. And George Soros got together with other leftists and decided that they were going to bring AIPAC down to size. And they had a plan. The first thing in their plan was they accused two officials, Rosen and I forgot the name of the other person, of treason, officials with AIPAC, because they wanted to discredit AIPAC. That lawsuit went on for 4 years before the charges were dropped, because they were phony charges. But they wanted to hurt AIPAC. That was the first thing. The second thing is they got the book written by Mearsheimer and Walt published called The Israel Lobby, which made the case that this lobby was way too powerful, because in reality, supporting Israel was a liability to the United States. That's what the left says. Israel is a liability to the United States, and if not for AIPAC, then we would see that and blow them off. And they didn't consider them to be an asset. Then he created J Street to be opposing AIPAC, and J Street has grown tremendously. And why not? The Jews are Democrats in the main, and they don't support Israel in the main. And J Street was just made to order. Now, J Street pretends to be pro-Israel. And this picks up from a point when I think an editor in Hearts or one of the left-wing papers asked America to rape them, because they didn't want America to wait for Israel's cue. They wanted America to show tough love and dictate to Israel what should be. This came from the editor, I think it was of Haaretz. And this is what the theme that J Street talks about tough love. We know what's good for Israel. We're going to this, we're going to that. And really, they're extremely anti-Israel. Then they managed to get Barack Obama elected. That was the fourth thing in their quiver. And the fifth thing was, excuse me, they wholeheartedly backed BDS. This was the left plan for how to overcome AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby, the pro-Israel Americans, actually. And as we know, 60 to 70 or 65 to 70% of Americans are extremely pro-Israel. The people, not the administration. So that was a little background I wanted to share with you. And I'll mention one other thing in that background, was that America, in all Israel's dealings and wars with the Arabs, was always protecting the Arabs and making sure that Israel would never defeat them entirely. They always forced a cessation of a ceasefire on them, and they always forced Israel to return to where they came from, including now they want to force them. That is the basic American policy, is to not let Israel beat up on the Arabs, to defeat them and not acquire more land. And when Kissinger said we'll go back to 67, there was almost a concession there, because 67 wasn't 48. Why 67? Maybe they thought the line was a better line than the 48 line. But he could have said 48, because there's no difference from Israel acquiring the land after 48 to 49 land. There's a lot of extra land. There's no difference in that land, which is being ceded to us, and the land we acquired in 67. There's no difference. We just acquired more as a result of war. So if you say you can have the land to 67, or to the ceasefire lines, why can't you have the land that we acquired in the 67 war? So that's a little background there. Now, Obama uses all his organs to discredit Israel and create the daylight that he wanted to create, right? And just show you how blatant. One of the organs is the CIA. The CIA published a report during this first 6 months. And the report ended with, it said, that given the enmity of the Arabs to the state of Israel, the state of Israel is doomed and shouldn't be supported by the US to her detriment. That is the mentality of the State Department. And as Dennis Ross just said, all prime minister or all presidents, when they come to office, they generally defer to their staff. There's a huge apparatus of thousands of people, diplomats, who know what's going on, recommend, and in general, the State Department dictates. Presidents don't go off on their own tangent. But luckily for Obama, he agreed with the State Department, so it was easy, and then he went one step further. Now, in the first summit that Obama and Netanyahu had in the White House, which was in May of that year, and Obama wanted to kickstart the peace process, and specifically, he wanted to get Netanyahu and Likud party to accept a two-state solution. This was imperative. Until that time, Likud never backed a two-state solution. Here we are 7 years later, and you think, it's always been a two, but Likud never backed it at that time. And that's what Obama wanted. Now, what Netanyahu wanted was a commitment from America to take out the nuclear facilities of Iran. And Obama said, not until you recognize a two-state solution, or embrace a two-state solution. Now, I am told by a prominent MK that Netanyahu came away from this meeting a changed man, a shell of his former self, in his words. And that MK, if memory serves me, was Aryeh Eldad. So, I want you to picture this. Imagine, if you will, being ordered by the mob at a casino to come into the back room due to your quote-unquote cheating. You see on entering some heavy-set men around a table on which there is a hammer, a buzzsaw, razor blades, a vice, acid, and a number of other persuaders. Well, you get the idea of what Netanyahu was faced with. The gloves came off, and the Obama administration put their persuaders on the table. Withdrawal of support at the UN, preventing Israel from using their GPS, which was needed to guide Israel missiles, planes, and tanks. Cancellation of the $3 billion in annual grants. Barring Israel from using American ammunition stored on Israel's soil. Refusing to resupply should Israel run out of ammunition. I can't even imagine all the persuaders that were put on the table. I remember, and you do too, I'm sure, when the PA was trying to get recognition at the UN, or when the PA got admitted to UNESCO, Israel was threatening to annex some land in response. I think that's what Naftali Bennett wanted. And they were threatening to withhold the money they were collecting. And Obama threatened them with the refusal to veto UN security resolutions if Israel did either of the two things and Israel stopped. Similarly, he used the same threat to get Israel to go to AIPAC and insist that AIPAC not push Congress to withhold funds from the PA for joining UNESCO. That's the background to why nothing happened. Okay. This was the background to the Barland speech delivered on June 09, just a couple weeks later, so you know where that speech came from, in which for the first time he called for two states for two peoples. He went on, though, to demand that, quote, Palestinians must clearly and unambiguously recognize Israel as the state of the Jewish people, and that a Palestinian state be demilitarized, quote, with ironclad security provisions for Israel, end of quote. Netanyahu also affirmed that there would be no building new settlements or expropriating additional land for existing settlements, which was one of Obama's demands, but he reserved the right to national growth within existing settlements. That's something that George Bush had been permitted, and Israel was doing it for quite some time. Netanyahu declared further, Jerusalem must remain the united capital of Israel, end of quote, and he flatly rejected the return of refugees to Israel. Considering the pressure that he was under, Netanyahu did well to create these caveats, protecting him from his embrace of the 2 states for 2 people, knowing all the while that Mahmoud Abbas would never agree to them. So there was no harm in doing it, and that's an arguable thing. Obama wasn't happy, but that was the best he could get. And he kept after Netanyahu until finally in the fall, he got Netanyahu to agree to a 10-month freeze, a construction freeze, without anything in return. Without anything in return. Now, as we know, that freeze, and that time the freeze wasn't to apply to Jerusalem. But as we know, declared or not, that freeze exists today, and it applies to Jerusalem. It was never abandoned, and Obama would never allow Israel to do their building. So that was a freeze, and nothing further happened after that first year. It was all fits and starts, all the efforts of Clinton, Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry were of no consequence, and nothing was accomplished. And that's where we are today. Although a little bit of building is going on, not much. And one other thing, Obama stipulated again that Israel can't build in Jerusalem, but the Arabs should build illegally if necessary. That's Obama's position. But it's also the European Union's position, and we'll come to that shortly. Now, I made the case in December of '09 that Obama intended to impose a solution on Israel, even though he had publicly agreed that all issues were to be negotiated. Obviously, they're at odds, but he fully intended to impose a solution. One of the moves that he made was to declare the Bush letter of '04 given to Sharon as non-binding. Elliot Abrams, who drafted the letter and was part of the negotiations, thought otherwise. The Bush letter backed Resolution 242, which demanded that Israel give up less than 100% of the land. Obama backed the Saudi plan, which demanded 100% of the land, even though the Saudi plan had no legitimacy, no legal standing, and had never been accepted by Israel. So Obama put it down as the core of his demand, totally ignoring the only legal resolution, which was 242. One wonders why Obama did so, because ultimately in the discussions, they were prepared to have Israel keep the settlement blocks, which was what Bush was aiming for. The rest was small potatoes. So why did he go to the trouble of countermanding the Bush letter? In my opinion, disavowing the letter was necessary since the letter included this little known commitment. And I have to tell you, in all my reading, I have never seen anybody refer to what I'm going to refer to now, quoted from the Bush letter. And this is what Sharon managed to get as one of the concessions for the disengagement. Quote, "The United States will do its utmost to prevent any attempt by anyone to impose any other plan." Has anybody ever heard that sentence? And that's in the Bush letter. That was a commitment The language couldn't have been stronger, committing America to do its utmost to prevent any other plan. And that's exactly what Obama wanted to do, was to present his own plan. Now here's another interesting factoid that you don't know about. In the aftermath of 9/11, you can imagine how the Bush administration was scrambling for the proper response, trying to figure out what to do. A couple weeks later, this is a key thing, Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense, sent a proposal to Bush calling for the administration to focus not on taking Osama bin Laden's network down, not on doing that, but on the aim of establishing new regimes in a series of states, including Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Sudan, and Somalia. Egypt was not included. So Rumsfeld was really focusing on the problem. He didn't want to go after this one little offshoot, and he said, let's go after the regimes, let's do them in. And the US military supported that, but Bush didn't. He was content to start with Iraq, and Iraq turns out to be such a hellhole, who would want to start with another country? But at that point of time, Rumsfeld thought this was the right response. Obama, on the other hand, adopted a variation of the, I'm going to leave it on the ground, okay? I'm not eating. Adopted a variation of the plan, and he decided to remove Gaddafi. Thank you. He decided to remove Gaddafi and Mubarak, and that was the beginning of the plan. Let's see. Okay. And to replace them with the Muslim Brotherhood. That was very much a part of the plan. And maybe this was in response to America couldn't nation build, so he was going to bring in the Muslim Brotherhood to run the country after they did what they did. Now, Libya, what a fiasco. On the pretext of avoiding a genocide, and they were saying, oh, they're going to kill 1,000 people, we have to do something. You've never seen anybody act so fast. And they got the UN, who is they? Qatar, Britain, and France got the UN to declare a no-fly zone over Libya. This escalated into a bombing campaign to destroy the Libyan army. This escapade cost the United States $1 billion. It only lasted a month. Cost Gaddafi his life, and cost the Libya its stability. It was particularly egregious because Gaddafi had previously made peace with the West. Gaddafi renounced his possessions of weapons of mass destruction. He decommissioned his chemical and nuclear weapons program, and he paid reparations. This was a few years ago, before they decided to invade Libya. And it was particularly galling because Gaddafi was a good leader. Gaddafi, for instance, provided free healthcare for all citizens and free education from kindergarten through to and including university. He was providing this. According to Ari Shavit, a prominent Haaretz columnist, he wrote, Libya was, quote, the best success the West had in the Arab world in the last 15 years, end of quote. So why did they take him down? I mean, it doesn't add up. In part, it was done to remove Russia and China from Libya, where they had been benefiting from oil and mineral licenses Gaddafi had granted to them. Europe considered Libya their backyard, and they were offended by the presence of Russia and China there. Though the French claimed that claimed the no-fly zone implemented over Libya was to protect civilians. A recently released April 20th, 1911, very on in this conflict, email sent to Hillary Clinton tells of less noble ambitions. The email identifies French President Sarkozy as leading the attack on Libya with 5 specific purposes in mind. 1, to obtain Libyan oil. 2, to ensure French influence in the region. 3, to increase Sarkozy's reputation domestically. 4, to assert French military power. And 5, to prevent Gaddafi's influence in what is considered Francophone or Francophonie Africa, which is Francophone. Okay. Most astounding was the lengthy section delineating the huge threat that Gaddafi's gold and silver reserves posed to the French bank circulating in a prime African currency. These reserves of Gaddafi were estimated at 143 tons of gold and a similar amount in silver. And they were concerned about the impact that all that wealth would have. In place of the noble sounding responsibility to protect doctrine fed to the public, there is this confidential explanation of what was really driving the war. Just recently, Obama, in his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, blamed the chaos in Libya on Britain and France for not having a follow-up plan to manage the territory. When you think about it, they bombed the you-know-what out of them and then left them. What's all that about? Look at the chaos that was immediately invited. Obviously, Obama should share most of the blame for the fiasco in Libya. Now, in Egypt, there was another story, but the same goal. In Egypt, Obama delivered a speech in Cairo dubbed A New Beginning. This was a very, very important speech. And Obama wanted the Muslim Brotherhood, who were a banned political party in Egypt, he insisted that the senior Muslim Brotherhood members be given the front row seats and be honored for this talk. Mubarak was so upset that he refused to attend the speech. 6 months later, Obama forced him out of office and forced early elections because early elections favored the Muslim Brotherhood rather than whatever democratic forces that were out there. And in June 2009, pardon me, in June 30th, 2012, Mohamed Morsi, representing the Brotherhood, was elected. Luckily, he lasted a year in office, and there was a military coup headed by General El-Sisi, who took over, banned the party again, and that takeover was made possible by Saudi Arabia because they gave him $8 billion to stabilize the Egyptian economy. Without that money, El-Sisi couldn't do it. And Saudi Arabia considered Mubarak to be a very good friend. You can imagine how incensed they were when Obama forced him out of office. So now El-Sisi is in control. And Obama hasn't given in yet. He's still backing the Muslim Brotherhood there and not backing El-Sisi as he should. As a result, El-Sisi turned to Russia, who is now selling weapons to them and to Israel. And that seems to be working somewhat for the moment. Now, when Obama was backing, this is a very interesting tale, when Obama was backing the Muslim Brotherhood in the lead up to deposing Mubarak, he got his director of national intelligence, James Clapper, to say the following: the term Muslim Brotherhood is an umbrella term for a variety of movements In the case of Egypt, a very heterogeneous group, largely secular, which has eschewed violence and has decried Al-Qaeda as a perversion of Islam. There is no overarching agenda, particularly in pursuit of violence, at least internationally. That was James Glasser, and he was the intelligence chief. Now this is what Izzy Liebler said. And Izzy Liebler is no right-winger. He's very right-wing, maybe slightly right of center. He's no right-winger. And this is what he said, in contrast. He said, the Muslim Brotherhood represents one of the most fanatical and dangerous of the radical Islamist groups in the region, with a dark record of violence and terrorism embedded in its DNA. It is rabidly anti-Western, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, committed to imposing Sharia law and a global caliphate, and willing to employ any means to further its objectives. Now, how about two different stories in contrast? Many would argue that Obama is also anti-Western, anti-Christian, and anti-Semitic. Just today, to bring you really right up to date, I read that El-Sisi wrote to Obama asking his help in defeating ISIS in Sinai and Libya. This was today. Debacle reports, in his note, he asked Washington to replicate in Sinai the format of U.S. intervention in the war on ISIS in Iraq and Syria, namely to send in special operations forces to establish bases and operate drones against jihadist targets. Unless stopped, he warned, the Islamic State is on the point of transforming the Sinai Peninsula into its primary forward base in the Middle East, bolstered by its branches of terror across North Africa and Libya. That indicates, because he's at the head of the military, how he really is concerned about the viability of Egypt fighting ISIS in the Sinai. And they've lost a lot of people. So far, Obama has ignored the plea. Russia and Israel may be asked to fill the void, but there's a very big problem there. So that's right up to date. In 2009, Saudi Arabia colluded to break the Syrian-Iran connection. And how they intended to do this, was to force Israel to give up the Golan for a peace agreement. You remember that they started negotiating for a peace agreement. And the idea was that they would help Assad, to get the Golan if Assad would break his relationship with Iran. That was the plan. That's why that was activated. And fortunately for Israel, Assad decided he'd rather have Iran than the Golan. And that was immediately dropped because he preferred Iran. He can always try to get the Golan later. As a result of that, both Saudi Arabia and America shifted gears and started calling for Assad had to go. But in the first year, it was a different story. They were kissing up to him to try to make this sweetheart deal at Israel's expense. The U.S. decided that when they removed him, they would put Turkey in charge, and Turkey was becoming more and more Islamist, together with the Muslim Brotherhood. That was the plan. And they were organizing all the people who were going to fight. Didn't matter if they were Al-Qaeda or who, anybody was okay if they would fight Assad. The U.S. was so committed to this idea of getting in bed with the Brotherhood again and these various terrorist groups that they refused to include in the discussions about what to do
the Kurds, any Democrats, and the seculars. They weren't even brought to the table. It was a done deal. And that was with American influence. At the time, it was clear that the alliance between the Obama administration and the Muslim Brotherhood was the cornerstone of Obama's new Middle East policy. Whereas Rumsfeld wanted to replace secular dictators by, quote, aiding local peoples to rid themselves of terrorists and to free themselves of regimes that supported terrorism. That was his object, end of quote. Obama wanted to replace them with the Muslim Brotherhood, who were themselves terrorists, and they were the people responsible for assassinating Sadat, if I'm not mistaken. By the summer of 2015, just last summer, Assad's position was very precarious. Russia committed to supporting him with their planes in a bombing campaign and created a no-fly zone over Syria, which necessitated both Israel and America knocking on Russia's door and asking for permission and rights to fly over Syria, and which they both did. Today is back on offense and recapturing territory. Had Obama taken resolute action in 2011, similar to the action that Russia is taking now, the war would have ended quickly, Assad would have been deposed, hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved, and crippled people, and there would be no refugee problem. So it is not possible to say it's not my fault, I didn't do anything, because doing something and not doing something is also doing something. If you choose not to do something, you're responsible for not doing it. And all the things that happened in Syria for the 4 years after could have been snuffed out immediately if America had done what Russia did. That's what a leader does. And right now there's a ceasefire, as you know. And although Russia came in and didn't worry about the Geneva Convention and bombed like crazy, because that's the only way to win a war, especially when you're fighting people who don't honor the Geneva Convention, you have to be prepared for a lot of collateral damage if you want to win the war. And that's what Russia did, and very quickly everybody fell into place. Now, Russia is now in charge, calling the shots. And Obama has become a bit player. Russia and the US have now agreed to a ceasefire, which seems to be holding, and they both seem to want Syria as a united secular state. Once again, the US doesn't want to invite the Kurds to the peace talk for fear of alienating Turkey, whereas Russia is pushing to have the Kurds at the negotiating table. Another very major difference. So far, the Kurds have had the best success in fighting ISIS. They have not been invited to the discussions on what to happen. American policy again, but Russia is fighting that. The Syrian Kurds want to have full autonomy within a federated state, and that means a huge amount of autonomy and very little control the state has, or to have a state of their own. Turkey is fighting this tooth and nail because it would embolden their own population to want the same deal. And just to explain, there's a little over 30 million Kurds in this region, close to 20 million, which is over 20% of the Kurdish population living in the southeast of Turkey are Kurds. And they've had a war going on for 20, 30 years. I don't know the full length of time. And so then there's about 4 million Kurds in Syria, 6 million Kurds in Iraq, and they have a form of autonomy now in Iraq. And they recently said that we're autonomous, but we're not getting the deal we like from the federated state of Iraq. We now want to have a referendum for statehood, to go their own way. So that hasn't worked out for them. From my own viewpoint, there is no way that Humpty Dumpty can be put back together again. They're forcing these different ethnic groups after the most bloody war you can imagine of coming to terms with each other. To my mind, the only solution is Alawite Syria, run by Assad, who cares. Kurdish Syria have their own state, and the Sunnis, which are mostly at the moment under the control of ISIS, having a state. Then they won't fight each other. The idea of holding them together in a state is beyond me, unless it's a path, once again, to get rid of the connection between Alawite Syria and Iran. And they still want to depose Assad because hoping to sever that, and that's what Saudi Arabia wants. Now, as you know, a few weeks ago, to everyone's surprise, Russia recently withdrew most of their military from Syria. I wondered whether this was a unilateral move or as part of an agreement with the US. I haven't read anything on that issue. Certainly, Assad and Iran were not happy. Nevertheless, just a week ago, Russia recommitted and militarily backed the Syrian forces who retook Palmyra, which was a big victory, and so Russia isn't out of the scene entirely. Now, for Islamic State, when Obama withdrew the last contingent of American troops from Iraq in 2011, the vacuum was quickly filled by ISIS, who took over more than half of Iraq and half of Syria. All these areas they took over were Sunni populated, and so the Sunni terrorists within ISIS have a native population that hides them, protects them, wants them, and they don't want to be ruled by Shiite Iran, Shiite Iraq, which Iran now controls. So the Sunnis in Iraq don't want to be part of that, and they rather join with the Sunnis from Syria. So that's an issue to watch as to what's happening. Now, who backs ISIS? Where did they come from? Their biggest backers are Saudi Arabia and Turkey, with the aid of America. And that's why America hasn't been too aggressive in bombing ISIS, because they needed ISIS to take Assad down. Very, very complicated, okay? But with the Islamic State now terrorizing the West, and it'll get much worse before it gets better, pressure is building to destroy them. But who's going to do it? The choices are either a bloody bombing campaign or a bloody land campaign, or both. But the whole area is Sunni, as I said, and the fighters are part of the population. Any occupier would be decimated, as Americans were decimated in Iraq. We'd been there before. Who wants to go back into trying to manage a hostile, terroristic type population? So it's a real big issue, what's going to happen with the Sunni area. And so the question now is, what is Russia and America going to do regarding the Sunni state? Now, we're nearing the end, you may be happy to hear. Israel has managed to stay out of the Syrian war and has stipulated 2 red lines. Their red lines are, she will not let Iran, Hezbollah, or ISIS occupy any territory adjacent to Israel. and she will prevent the transport of any heavy weapons from Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And she has acted on those red lines in the past. So far, so good. A Syrian unified secular state that allegedly is what Russia and America want now would be very good news for Israel. Okay. Now, Iran. In 2014, I think, maybe 2013, we learned that Obama was conducting secret negotiations for the last year on a back channel with Iran, which is par for the course. Whenever there's always back doors, they go and see what they can arrange. But this will surprise you. As early as 2009, DEBCA had a report, which I'm going to read you, which is astounding. DEBCA files Washington sources report that the Obama administration is on the threshold of a major rapprochement with Tehran, a reversal of US policy dramatic enough to block out international sanctions. Iran will be allowed to keep its nuclear program, including military elements and enriched uranium stocks, up to the point of actually assembling a weapon. Tehran will hold the upper hand by retaining the option to go forward and build a bomb within 1 month of a decision to do so, and mount warheads on ballistic missiles already standing ready. DEBCA files Washington sources report that the Obama administration, like its predecessor, will throw everything they have against an Israeli prime minister who ventures to employ its long-range arm. Now, many people don't believe DEBCA, don't think that they're reliable enough, and you can't believe what DEBCA writes. But this is in a different category. DEBCA is writing what will happen, and it happened. Where did they get this information? So the actual deal was very, very close to what they forecast in 2009. I found that mind-blowing. Now, currently, Iran is violating both the Iran deal and various UN resolutions, and many people and congressmen are calling for strict enforcement. The problem is that you can't enforce a non-existing agreement. And in law school, they say the parties have to be ad idem of the same mind in order for there to constitute an agreement. But here, there were two very different versions of the agreement. The one agreement was given to the Congress to approve, and a different agreement was approved by the Iran parliament. They never agreed on the same deal. And specifically, Iran never agreed to the snapback provisions for sanctions. They never agreed to the same deal. Another thing, there was a UN Security Council resolution, 2231, was sold to Congress as an endorsement of the deal. Both were touted as major achievements to stop Iran's quest to build and deliver a nuclear bomb. Unfortunately, Iran never accepted this resolution as valid or enforceable. So much for the Iran deal. In October 2013, we all cheered when Netanyahu told the UN General Assembly, quote, "I want there to be no confusion on this point. Israel will not allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. If Israel is forced to stand alone, Israel will stand alone." And that's in reference to a threat that Obama had made. If you act alone, you will stand alone. And that he was specifically calling him out on that we will act. We're not worried about standing alone. And last week, Amos Yadlin, head of the Israel National Security Studies, said that, quote, "Israel Air Force can meet the challenge of exterminating Iran's nuclear reactors if necessary." This was just last week. So that's Israel's state of mind. And that's the end of my talk. So,